Every 4 years, the world stops. Billions of people pause their lives. Work stops, arguments stop, sleep stops. For 90 minutes, nothing else exists. The World Cup is not just a tournament. It is the greatest stage in human history, the place where legends are born, the place where ordinary men become immortal, the place where countries lose their minds and gain their souls. And then there is George Best. George Best never played at a World Cup. Not a single minute, not a single second, not a single step onto that sacred grass. Let that sink in. The man Pelé himself called the greatest player he had ever seen. The man who made 100,000 people hold their breath every time he received the ball. The man who had more natural football talent than any human being who ever laced up a pair of boots. He never stood on that stage. And that is one of the most heartbreaking stories in the entire history of football. But here is what nobody ever tells you about that story. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't just wrong place, wrong time. Because the story of George Best and the World Cup is really a much deeper story. It is the story of what happens to a genius when the world's greatest stage is locked away from them forever. What it does to their mind, what it does to their soul, what it does to a life. This is that story. George Best was born on May 22nd, 1946, in Belfast, Northern Ireland, a small city, a divided city, a city being torn apart by political and religious conflict that the rest of the world barely understood, a city that had no particular reason to expect anything miraculous. But miracles don't care about expectations. George grew up on a council estate in the Craigag area of East Belfast. No money, no glamour, no connections to the football world, just a skinny kid with a tennis ball and an ability that nobody in the neighborhood could quite explain. He saw the game differently. While other kids chased the ball, George seemed to know where it was going before it got there. While other players needed space to do their tricks, George could operate in an inch of space and come out the other side with the ball still glued to his foot. His balance was supernatural. His awareness was frightening. His brain processed the game at a speed that made everyone else look like they were moving through water. At 15 years old, a Manchester United scout named Bob Bishop went to watch a schoolboy match in Belfast. He saw something he had never seen before. That evening, he sent a telegram to United's legendary manager, Sir Matt Busby. The telegram had 4 words. "I think I found a genius." He had found exactly that. Within 2 years, George Best was playing for Manchester United's first team. He was 17 years old. He looked like he was 12. And he played like he was from a different planet. But here is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because while George was becoming something extraordinary at Manchester United, the national team he would represent, Northern Ireland, was heading in a completely different direction. Not up, down. To understand George Best's World Cup tragedy, you need to understand Northern Ireland's position in world football. In 1958, Northern Ireland had performed a genuine miracle. They qualified for the World Cup in Sweden. They reached the quarterfinals. A nation of barely 1 million people, competing against the giants of world football. It was extraordinary. It was historic. The whole country had felt it. But that generation aged out. And the next generation, George Best's generation, simply did not have the same depth. Northern Ireland was a tiny nation with limited resources, limited infrastructure, limited quality beyond their one extraordinary individual. They had football passion. They had spirit. They had pride. They had George Best, and only George Best. Think about what that actually means. Close your eyes and think about it. The most talented footballer on earth. A player with abilities so rare that it might never be seen again. Playing for a national team that could not compete at World Cup level no matter what he did. It was like putting the world's greatest racing driver in a broken car and asking him to win the championship alone. In the 1966 qualifying campaign, Northern Ireland competed. George was electric in every game he played. He dragged teammates through matches that had no right to be close, but they fell short. England hosted the World Cup that year. The tournament was held right next door, in their neighbors' stadiums. in their neighbors' streets. And Northern Ireland watched from outside. In 1970, the same story. George was now 23 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, the greatest player in the world in his prime. And Northern Ireland did not qualify. In 1974, with George now past 30, the knees slightly slower, the hair slightly longer, they tried again. And they failed again. 3 World Cups, 3 qualifying failures. 3 times the greatest player alive sat at home while the rest of the world celebrated football's greatest festival. 3 times. In 1968, something happened that should have been the beginning of a dynasty. Manchester United won the European Cup, the biggest prize in club football at that time. And George Best was the heartbeat of that victory. In the quarter-final against Benfica, one of the most powerful clubs in Europe, United traveled to Lisbon. The atmosphere was terrifying. Benfica had never lost at home in European competition. Their stadium was a fortress. Their fans believed they were untouchable. George Best had not read that memo. Inside the first 12 minutes, George had scored twice. He had turned the game, turned the stadium, turned the entire narrative of the tie on its head. He had done it alone, in a hostile environment, against world-class opponents, in front of 75,000 people who wanted him to fail. He had loved every second of it. The next morning, the Portuguese newspapers ran his photograph across their front pages. They gave him a nickname that would last for the rest of his life, El Beato, the 5th Beato. George Best was more famous than most rock stars at that point. His face was on magazine covers, his name sold newspapers. Women screamed at him in the street. He was the first footballer to be treated the way modern footballers are treated, as a global celebrity, as a cultural icon, as something beyond sport. He won the Ballon d'Or in 1968, the award for the best player in the world. He was 22 years old. He had achieved everything a club footballer could achieve. And now the world waited for the World Cup version of George Best, the version that would play against Pelé's Brazil, against West Germany, against the great football nations. What records would he break? What moments would he create? What would the world look like when the greatest player on earth finally stood on the greatest stage? That version of George Best never came. Sometime in the early 1970s, something inside George started to fracture. It is hard to pinpoint exactly when. These things never happen in a single moment. They happen slowly, quietly, invisibly, like a crack appearing in a wall, small at first, easy to miss. And then one day, the whole structure gives way. George had always carried weight that most people couldn't see. The pressure of being a genius, the loneliness that comes with talent, so exceptional, it separates you from ordinary life. The anxiety of being the most famous man in Belfast during a period when Belfast was on fire. His childhood friends were living through violence and conflict, while George was in Manchester, playing football, becoming a global icon. That guilt has a weight to it, a specific, silent, crushing weight. Because the World Cup wasn't just glory, it was meaning. It was the place where a footballer could prove that their talent was not wasted on the world, that it mattered, that the universe had not arranged things so that the most gifted player alive would spend his entire career invisible on football's biggest stage. George knew. He knew early. He knew Northern Ireland would not qualify. His World Cup was not coming. The mountain that every footballer dreamed of climbing was simply not his to climb. And without that mountain, something essential was missing. He walked away from Manchester United at 27 years old. Not because his legs were gone. Not because his skill had faded. His body was fine. His talent was still there, waiting. But his mind was looking for something that football could no longer give him. He came back. He left again. He played for Fulham, for Hibernian, for smaller clubs across Britain. He went to America and played in the ASL. He went to Australia. He kept moving, kept searching, kept trying to fill the space where his football purpose had been. He never found what he was looking for, because what he was looking for was a World Cup that was never going to come. George Best died on November 25, 2005. He was 59 years old. His liver had finally failed. Decades of struggling, decades of searching, decades of carrying a talent too large for any ordinary life had taken everything from him. He left no World Cup medals. He left no World Cup goals. He left no World Cup memories. And yet, at his funeral in Belfast, thousands of people lined the streets, not to mourn a champion, not to honor a World Cup winner, They lined up to say goodbye to the most naturally gifted footballer who had ever lived, to a man who had given them joy and wonder and pride without ever being given the stage he truly deserved. Decades after his death, something extraordinary continues to happen. George Best's highlights still circulate online. His goals, from grainy black and white footage shot in the 1960s, still make people stop scrolling, still make people lean forward, still make people say out loud, to nobody in particular, how did he do that? Is that even possible? Pelé said he was the greatest. Maradona said he was the greatest. Cruyff watched him and shook his head in admiration. Players who won World Cups, who had every reason to let their medals define the conversation, still looked at George Best and said something different. They said, that man was something else entirely. Here is the question that George Best and said something different. They said, that man was something else entirely. Here is the question that George Best's story forces us to ask. And it is a question with no easy answer. Is the World Cup a measure of greatness, or is it a measure of geography? If you are born in Brazil, you have generations of football culture, millions of talented players, and a national team structure built to qualify. If you are born in Argentina, in France, in Germany, in Spain, you inherit institutions, infrastructure, depth. If you are born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in 1946, you get George Best, and not much else. George did not choose where he was born. He did not choose his national team. He did not choose to be a genius in a country that could not support his genius on football's biggest stage. He had no say in any of it. He only chose how he played. And how he played was unlike anything the world had ever seen. So what does the World Cup actually prove? It proves that the best national team won. It does not always prove that the best player played. Sometimes, the most extraordinary human talent in a generation never even reaches the tournament. Sometimes the universe arranges things in ways that are simply, undeniably, heartbreakingly unfair. George Best is proof of that. And proof makes us uncomfortable when the answer doesn't fit the story we want to tell. But maybe there is a different way to read this entire story. Maybe George Best's greatness was so obvious, so undeniable, so impossible to contain, that even without a World Cup, the world still knew, still knows, will always know. You cannot search for George Best World Cup highlights because they do not exist. But you know his name. You feel what it represents. You understand instinctively that this man belonged among the very greatest who ever played the game. That is not a small thing. That is extraordinary. Because the World Cup gives players their legend. The stage creates the mythology. The trophy seals the legacy. George Best had none of those tools. He built his legend on muddy winter pitches in England, in hostile stadiums in Europe, in a city that was tearing itself apart. From nothing, without football's greatest stage, he built something timeless. He was the greatest player who never played a World Cup final. But perhaps that is exactly what makes his story worth telling, more than any champion story. Not the trophy he won, not the tournament he played in, but the fact that even without all of that, he still made the entire football world stop and watch. Some players need the World Cup to become immortal. George Best became immortal anyway. And if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about what kind of player he was, nothing ever will.